and welcome to the Drax Files Radio Hour with Jo Yardley, soon to be renamed as the Drax Files Radio Hour without Jo Yardley, but with Kent Bai. No, I'm just kidding. We are back in 2 weeks, actually, with regular programs, but I just stepped off a plane coming back from the Sundance Film Festival, as some people may know. And who do I bump into repeatedly at the Sundance Film Festival? Kent Bai from Voices of VR podcast, affiliated with Road to VR. And why, Kent, are you? Well, thank you, first of all, for doing the podcast.
Yeah, that's great to be here, Drax. It was great to run into you in Park City as well.
But what are you doing at a film festival? I thought you were obsessed with virtual reality.
Well, I think that virtual reality, in terms of telling stories, is going to be one of the key things. I think the thing I'm taking away is that content is king, and that the content that actually has a narrative component and tells a good story in the end is going to be what is going to make virtual reality successful. And where else better to find the top kind of storytellers than at the Sundance Film Festival?
And also we have to, this was obviously slightly tongue-in-cheek, because some people that follow me or you or both of us on Twitter know by now that there was a substantial VR component at the film festival at the New Frontier building. I think there were 37 exhibits.
Yeah, 37 different virtual reality exhibits, and I actually had a chance to try out all of them. So.
Unbelievable. How did you do this? Because we also need to say that... you needed. It was really popular. So we had to sign up on a list, and one multiplayer thing. I think they told me there's an 8-hour list, and I stepped off a plane in Paris as a layover, and then the text came in that we're now ready for you at the New Frontier VR exhibit.
Yeah, what I did was quite a feat, considering that each experience would take on average about an hour to. Sometimes more to get in. It was a combination of being at the right place at the right time. So helping one of the filmmakers debug some errors that they were having, and I had early access to one of the phones that had 19 of the experiences on them. I was able to watch them, stay up all night watching all the mobile VR apps. And then I just got into different press times to be able to see other experiences, but pretty much concentrated the first 2 or 3 days of just trying to see as much stuff as I could, and as well as doing about 20 interviews while I was there. So it was a really great time, and I was really trying to focus in on storytelling in VR. What does it mean, and who's doing stuff that's really interesting and innovative. Right. So
let me set the scene real quick, and then I want to ask you for your top experiences and what stood out. You mentioned it already. There were several Gear VR experiences, and once you signed up with the Gear VR folks, then you could choose out of 19, and sometimes they would let you sit there and kind of cycle through several of them. They were different in length, and then there were Oculus experiences, and then Vive experiences. And also Samsung had their own separate building where they had, and that was interesting, and I will run this audio later when we're back on the air after the break. They did an introduction which I found interesting. They really told you how to put it on, to put then swivel around in your chair. So really, for a complete novice of this experience, they had 3 or 4 tutors basically. I found that very interesting. The other ones were just put them on and see where you go. So they assumed a certain familiarity with the goggles. Now, and lastly, and then I'll let you talk. What we also need to mention, I think, was that there was an attempt. A friend of mine, Lynette Walworth, that I worked with at Bayvac, made an experience, and I also want your take on this one. It's called Collisions, about an Australian man who witnessed the atomic bomb explosion in the 50s, the tests. And thought that the gods came down from the earth, and it was a mixture of real virtual reality filmed with a drone and on the ground cameras and a little bit of CGI. That to me really completely stood out, and there was an attempt to synchronize 70 plus Samsung Gear VRs for people who sat in a movie theater and had basically a simultaneous experience, despite them being isolated with the Samsung Gear VR.
Yeah, I was actually there. It was 200.
And how did you get in there? Jesus Christ. I couldn't get in.
Yeah, so there was someone from 2-Bit Circus who got me a ticket to get in, and I did an interview with Nancy Collins from 2-Bit Circus afterwards. And so it was a power of storytelling panel, and at the end they had 200 Samsung Gear VR headsets that they passed along, and they had on the top of them a little LED, and from the 2-Bit Circus has this technology to be able to synchronize all of the different headsets. So what's interesting is that I actually did watch this VR experience of Collisions before. I actually watched it with a room full of people, and I'll tell you, Drax, I didn't notice any difference of watching it alone versus whether or not I was in an audience in a theater with 200 people up until the very end when people started to clap.
Very interesting.
I think that, comedies where people are laughing and having more engagement, I think that we'll have a little bit more of that as well. But the thing that's important about this technology, I think, is that, like we were talking about, at the New Frontiers section, it was kind of designed for people who have some spare time to come by. Maybe they'll drop and see a VR experience. Well, their experience of that would be like they would go there, they would want to try to see a VR experience, kind of drop in, and they would say, okay, come back in 3 hours, because the lines were just so crazy with so many people. The interest and demand was way beyond what I think Sundance had really even expected. It was, 37 different experiences, whereas years before they had like 10 or 15. So they kind of doubled the amount of experiences that are available and didn't really expand the amount of space that was available. And the demand was just through the roof with people coming in every day. Some of the experiences like the Martian experience, where you're kind of flying around this deep block, the chair, it's a haptic chair, and you're using the touch controllers and you're flying around. It's kind of like it took 15 to 20 minutes to go through, and people, unless you were there right when they opened, there was basically no way that you're going to get in and see it.
So. That was logistics. I mean, I would also really criticize those logistics, but let's not stay too much on these logistics real quick, because you mentioned The Martian. Obviously, that's accompanying the Martian film. So that's I wanted to say that one of my impressions was that there were a few. I mean, this is the obvious example of sort of a high-end tie-in with a known film. The other one was the holo cinema with Star Wars, which was really cool. Maybe you can describe it later. But let's describe some of these experiences. Collisions, do you want to talk about how that was? Was that good for you? Was it impressive?
I think there was moments in it that were good, and the challenge with a film like that is that you're kind of being. It's
a longer film. I mean, it's one of the longest.
Yeah, it's
for 15 minutes.
I really did enjoy the different kind of CG moments. The sound was a little muddled. It was hard to track sometimes, but I think there was some moments when they basically are projecting these scenes of Oppenheimer and atomic bombs exploding onto they're projecting it onto a screen in the middle of the desert. You kind of look around and you have these Aboriginal people watching these clips, and just some profound quotes from the Bhagavad Gita from Oppenheimer talking about, what have we done? We're destroying the world.
Let me briefly set the scene. This is narrated by Lynette Walworth, and we follow this Aboriginal man. The name escapes me now. We're going to link to it, but it's basically you're in this desert, and there's cuts between a stationary camera, a 360 camera on the ground, and then a drone. And then when the atom bomb explodes, and like you said, then the Aboriginal man and his family, they watch. Lynette brought a projector and showed them clips from Oppenheimer where he tears up, talking about that he didn't want to, he didn't foresee the madness that was going to be unleashed through his invention, basically. But also then there's the CGI moment where the bomb explodes, and these animals are dying, and the whole ground and stuff, the ashes fall from the sky. What did you think about the mixture of real 360 video and then CGI? Does that work for you?
I think it's okay. Yeah, we saw a couple of experiences like that. Nani de la Peña had a couple of across the line where she mixes live cinema verite kind of documentary footage of someone going into an abortion and then having a man come up who's a protester trying to convince them to turn around and not get it. And then you kind of mix to the CG part where it's a little bit more dynamic and interactive, and you have to like kind of walk by all these protesters who are screaming at all these horrible things about being a whore and this Jezebel feminist slut and stuff like that they got actual recordings and then kind of recreated in CG. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. There still can be a little bit of uncanniness sometimes when you have an interactive component.
Is that the issue? That's the uncanny valley. The avatar's not right there a little bit too much. Or?
I think so. There's two. There's interactive and then there's non-interactive. And so the non-interactive, there's another one from Nani de la Peña called Kia, which I think was done pretty well. You can actually increase the stereoscopic effects of, she just took this 9/11 audio of these three sisters who were trying to prevent the husband of one of the sisters from, acting out in a domestic violence situation. And they just had the audio to go off of.
Right. And let me set the scene. Sorry, I'm jumping in. I'm setting the scene and then I'll let you analyze it. So this is also, you're in sort of this trailer park and there is already an altercation and the husband has a gun. The sisters scream, the two sisters trying to calm him down, and the scene cuts. So you're basically standing right there with them in the trailer, and then boom, you're cut, and then you're outside of the trailer and you hear this audio, the 911 call, where the sister is pleading, please come fast, where are you? And so your position shifts between inside the trailer and then outside waiting for the cops to come. That's something that I found really, really well done, because then when I'm being sort of teleported back into the trailer, all of a sudden I'm really close to the guy with the gun, right? That's really scary.
And really powerful, too. Like, they're just taking source audio and being able to recreate the scene that you kind of feel like you were there. And it makes this really strong point about domestic violence that, I think it was really moving to me. That's an example that was completely CG, that was pulled off really well. There's other ones called Sonar, which I think was probably the most sophisticated, like CG, kind of horror, sci-fi. You're in this ship underwater and there's different probes, and it kind of takes these different turns of events that, kind of had these like, wow, that's like really shocking, or this sort of horror element to it. But just the editing and the pacing and, people coming from a film background and applying these different skills of telling a story and applying it and creating this 360 completely CG film. The thing about CG versus 360 video, I think, is that you can get really much better stereoscopic effects. A lot of at this point, a lot of the cameras that are out there, I think if I were to rate them, like Felix and Paul's technology that they have, where they've created some sort of like parabolic curve mirror so that they can get just no stitching lines at all, and has the, like, to me, what looks like to be the best stereoscopic camera out there. And then number two would like be like the Google Jump, and then maybe Jaunt, and then there's a lot of homebrewed cameras that people are using as well.
Do you know if the Felix and Paul setup, is that proprietary? Do they kind of lease that out, or how does that work? As
far as I know, it's completely proprietary, and they're the only ones that have really used it. But when you look at it, they have a couple of a series called Nomads, where they'll take this. It'll be kind of like this meditative anthropologic study, where they'll just put the camera into these places, and you get this interesting effect where I think it just feels like people forget that the camera's there, and they're just acting completely natural. Whereas if you have like a camera crew, a 2D film, it kind of requires all these people to actually be running the cameras. But you could just set up this 360 camera sphere and people just act normally, and you just get this real, true, authentic, voyeuristic experience of like kind of feeling like you're actually there, getting to watch all these different cultural expressions of these different nomadic people.
Felix and Paul Studios, I just wanted to mention that we link to all the stuff that we're mentioning here. This is a studio. They had several different experiences there. They are sort of on the forefront of also very kind of commercial endeavors, like the LeBron James experience, where you sort of in his mansion, you can swim in his pool. That was not at Sundance. That wouldn't match, I think.
Yeah, no, they have a gig with Oculus. I think they're doing a number of different experiences to kind of show the potential for how transportive you can get when you get these 360 videos. Because I think that you get a really strong sense of presence. At least I do when I see some of their pieces, and they're the type of things that they probably do the best job of kind of composing a 360 degree. They put these cameras in places where you look all around and there's something interesting to look at. Juxtaposed to something like Collisions, it's in the middle of the desert. And so while giving a kind of immersive experience of being in the outback, may not be actually the most compelling thing is to see it. I get a sense of it, but I was kind of like wanting to see a little bit more of like inside the house, for example.
Yeah, but that's where they live. See, I found that really cool. There is also, because that loneliness there. I mean, that's part of that's their life. They live in that environment, and it's barren and it's lonely. And then there's a bicycle coming behind you. Then you turn around. Real quick, I was going to ask you: does it bother you that well, first of all, what kind of cameras are there? I know from Collisions, they were able to get the John cameras that are, I guess, not really accessible price-wise for anybody who doesn't have a lot of money. But what other options are there right now to film 360 video? I mean, there is. I mean, for the general public, there's the Ricoh Theta.
Yeah, the Ricoh Theta is probably the one that's probably the most popular and accessible, the consumer grade camera. And I think at this point, there's people like Morris May who have to basically construct their own for perspective, which I think is another experience worth mentioning, because it tells a story from 4 different perspectives of a police shooting, 2 cops and 2 adolescent teenagers of color. And it does such a great job, because what they did was they took these 4 different perspectives and they created 4 different films. If you were to just watch one of the films, you would just get they would intercut between the 4 characters, so you would get one segment of the story, and you would have to watch all 4 segments of the story in order to get the full story. And it wasn't until the last segment that I watched that I really saw things that happened that I hadn't seen before. It really completely changed my idea of what the story was. And so I did an interview with Rose Trochet, and she was talking about the vulnerability of the first-person perspective, how that's kind of like how life is. It's like it's flawed. We have eyewitness testimony that, we have our biases that kind of are dictating what we're paying attention to and what we're noticing. And, if I were to watch this experience again, I might actually be on the lookout for some of these things that I wasn't looking for before. So it's a really brilliant exploration for the potential of first-person storytelling and narrative, and really ambitious. And Morris May had to create these special cameras that would fit basically over somebody's head, so that it would give that kind of like you were there, like a stand-in for the character.
That experience is called, what is it called, The Misdemeanor?
It's called Perspective, Chapter 2, The Misdemeanor. I think in terms of narrative storytelling, it was probably the most ambitious project that I saw there. So there's another one called A Hard World for Small Things, which did a really interesting thing with using 360 video. And there was a scene where they were doing positional audio, where if you're looking to the right, you could hear the character's conversation. And there are people being on the left as well, that if you looked at them, then the audio would shift so you could actually listen to what they were saying. So to me, it was one of the first examples that I really saw of kind of like doing live editing of like which dialogue are you going to track, which storyline you're going to track within a 360 video. It was kind of like this parallel experience of having many things going on, and you could kind of edit your own experience based upon what you were looking at, just by using like positional audio.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the audio is a fascinating thing. There was a Funny or Die video where you're interrogated by a good cop, bad cop team. And that became apparent to me that the audio is potentially, I mean, I have never, this is my big goal next month, to just, for the fun of it, try something and then put together an audio. Because when you move your head, when the source moves and I move my head at the same time, then it's basically chaos.
Yeah, there was a whole panel from the Dolby Atmos that had Morris May and a representative from Dolby. And I know that on the perspective, they did use Dolby Atmos technology. So, a lot of people talk about ambisonics as an audio solution, and where they're basically recording 4 channels of audio. And some of these VR experiences seem to have pretty well integrated, within the Milk VR player to be able to fully take advantage of your head tracking and to be able to somehow give you that directional audio that I think makes a huge difference when you're actually in VR.
Explain to listeners who is Chris Milk and what is Milk VR. Is that a VR standard?
Oh, so Milk VR is different than Chris Milk. So first, let's do Milk VR. Milk VR is the kind of the video player for Samsung. If you have a Gear VR and it comes with Milk VR, and that's kind of like Samsung's distribution mechanism for their videos. And they had a huge presence at Sundance this year, Samsung, where they were doing all sorts of different giveaways, and they had a whole huge Gear VR theater, which they were showing some of these premieres, like you mentioned, the Interrogation from Funny or Die, and some of their own kind of horror film thriller pieces, I think called Gone Home or Gone Away or something like that. But they were premiering different things in their actual theater. So what that tells me is that Samsung is really looking for the cinematic VR experiences to be able to take people to these all around the world. And Oculus is in charge of putting all of the different dynamic games and interactive apps. They're kind of the gatekeepers for what gets onto the Gear VR, and Samsung is really focusing in their niche onto the cinematic aspect. And you kind of see how they were trying to recruit a lot of filmmakers and other storytellers to be able to give them exposure for some of this technology so that they could eventually create their own VR. And I think that this year at New Frontier, we started to see a number of people who may have had their first exposure to VR at Sundance and have started to come back and create their own experiences.
I want to mention an experience that really impacted me. It's called 6x9, and that's a preview. You are in solitary confinement for 6 minutes, and there's also real audio from a prison, and it's totally horrifying. And frankly, on the way there, I look through the catalog and go like, okay, this I gotta do, this I gotta do. And the solitary confinement issue is so dear to me. I'm so appalled by what we do, especially with teenagers sometimes as well, that I thought I can't even do this. It's going to make me really mad. And then I did it, and it's just, it's totally horrifying.
Yeah, well, I think it's called the 6x9, an immersive experience of solitary confinement. And I would question whether or not it's really a goal of trying to give you an immersive experience of solitary confinement, because it's more of a really brilliant way of using all different types of immersive storytelling techniques to tell the horrors of the psychological damage of solitary confinement.
That's right. It's not there to kind of sort of shock me into sort of believing I'm actually in there. There's a lot of informational components. It's basically it's a 3D article to read about certain facts about solitary confinement, I guess.
Yeah, it's Francesca Pineda was one of the key kind of creators of this, and I did an interview with Francesca, and it's already on my Voices of VR podcast. And she was doing a lot of really innovative things in terms of storytelling there that we kind of dive into and unpack. And, her background is in audio production. And so one of the subtle things that may not be immediately evident is that she's got these soundscapes and a real strong audio narrative from taking direct interviews from people. But one of the things that I didn't notice, but when she said it, I kind of noticed, is that she had her interview subjects address you in the second person. So she would tell you things like, you're going to experience this. This is what you're going to experience. Look around the room. You'll notice, you can count the number of blocks, notice the cracks. And so there was something really brilliant about how she was able to connect that interviews to be able to connect you more to the physical space. A lot of times, like audio and VR experiences will kind of be disconnected, and you'll having a narrative that maybe you'll be overwhelmed with what's happening in the scene. And for me, sometimes it's hard to actually track the audio narrative while at the same time of seeing, taking on all the visuals, especially if they're not supporting each other. But this is an experience where you're just in this solitary cell and all the audios kind of like connect you more to your physical environment. And so to me, that was part of what was making it such a powerful experience, is that, as the audio was going, it was just more and more connecting you to the space.
Is this immersive journalism like Noni is doing?
Yeah, I think it's totally like immersive journalism, because they're doing a lot of reporting of facts, but just doing it in a way that I think is really elegant. And instead of just fading to black and putting text on the screen, they would do things like kind of project these stats and all this data points onto the wall. And it was less about whether or not you were getting everything and more about just kind of like whatever you happen to pay attention to and see is what you were meant to get out of it. So,
and you're still in the space, because they're projecting, like you said, they're projecting things like the type of infractions that gets you solitary, those facts on the wall. So you're still in the cell while you're getting that information in. You're never
Correct.
leaving it, and you're floating around. At some point, where one of the protagonists says that when you're in there too long, you kind of start sort of floating around, basically, or he had that impression that his body was floating around.
Yeah, there's a challenge with, when you're in a VR experience, how do you keep it interesting? And, there's different film techniques of cutting and, kind of moving the story along. And one of the things that Francesca was doing was kind of blurring your vision, making you float around, and then showing things on the environment. At what point there was a whole interactive gaze-based element where it turned into a non-linear decision, whether or not, depending on what you were looking at, let's say it was a book or a letter, whatever you were looking at would tell a different story. So you could actually make a choice of like, oh, do I want to hear the story that's behind this letter, or do I want to hear the story that's behind the book? And so it was just doing a lot of really interesting things, I thought, of storytelling in VR and making a lot of innovations and in the form of what I think we're going to see a lot more of going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, briefly, and I'm mindful of the time. I'm looking here at the time as well. Let's see where I was going to go. Does it bother you that in some of these experiences you're disembodied? That's an issue I have. That comes probably from sort of this investment into my Second Life avatar and sort of that identification that there is a person that I'm sending out into whatever it is, a virtual world or some other experiences. I would think, and I don't know how practical it is, because if we're talking about an in and out type of experience, or is it even necessary to have a body that you're sending in there? But I found it weird with Across the Line, where you are sort of spying on people. You're in the car while they're driving to the abortion clinic. The guy yells at you. You're sort of this ghost in the car.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I did this interview with Devin Dolan from Cinetic Media, and he wrote a whole article about the 4 different types of interactivity within a VR experience. And you can kind of break it down this way. Either you're a ghost, where you're not a part of the story at all, you're just there kind of as a voyeur, or you're a character that is a part of the plot, where they're actually addressing you. And the other is whether or not you have an impact on the story at all, or your experience, or you don't. And so between those two axes, you kind of have like a passive voyeur where you have no impact, you're a complete ghost. And that I'm not bothered as much if I don't have a body, because really I don't have an impact on the story. It could add an additional level of presence if like you're flying around in a spaceship, but it could actually take you out of it when you notice that you're in the Gear VR and you try to move your arms around and they're not reacting. It could actually break presence. So sometimes you may have like, you may be a character that's addressed like in the non-Dilopania. I think it probably makes more sense in that point. But in that case, you have no little impact on the actual story because you're just there as a plot device, but you're not actually impacting the story. Sometimes as a ghost, you're not addressed as a character, but sometimes you can flavor your experience. That's another type of experience where, it may or may not make sense to have a body. And the fourth type is that you are a character that's addressed in the story, and you have impact on how the outcome is. And I think in that case, it totally makes sense. And we didn't see any that were at that level. I think that's sort of like the part of the ultimate potential of having kind of like this local and global agency within a story where, you have some sort of local flavorings of your own experience, but you're able to actually change the outcome of the story. And at this point, we didn't really see any of that. Maybe the Leviathan project, which is this mixed reality.
I was just going to get there because there's also presence. It was brilliant, except for that I didn't see my hands.
Yeah, and probably the most actually so the Leviathan project is this mixed reality project where they have like this green table and you have to kind of move objects into different places, and they have the OptiTrack trackers so that they're tracked both in physical reality and in virtual reality, and so it gives this additional sense of presence.
Let me set it up a little bit more. So you do have a physical table. You have physical objects. They have little tracking balls on them. Everything is tracked. So the virtual representation you see inside the goggles have a representation in physical reality. So if you lift something, you touch it, and then you lift it inside the experience as well, in that strange sort of steampunkish room, and it's based on a book that I didn't know, so I guess the visual aesthetic is based on the Leviathan books. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I don't know what I think that it seemed like their own mythology that they.
No. Somebody told me, but since we both don't know, we'll just link to it. People can read on it. The point is that we have a table, and we have objects on the table, and we physically move these objects with our tracked hands and the tracked objects, and that to me was frankly unbelievable. That I saw immediately a vision of sort of a modular home kit. Can you imagine? Maybe they can sell a modular home kit made of foam, or I don't know, and you kind of buy it on Amazon, you stick it together, you buy it comes with a tracking system. I mean, this is years out, but then you can put that into your garage, and maybe you have 3-4 experiences or stories that work with those physical objects, because that was the missing link. I mean, the sense of presence with being able to lean on the table and move these objects, and then move them into a different place, and then inside the virtual experience you hear sounds, and you hear the reactions when you these veils that you put over there, and they kind of then begin to glow. It was the sense of presence was unbelievable.
Yeah, this is what they would call passive haptics, where you're able to have this mixed reality experience where you have a representation of an object in virtual reality, but this also has a physical representation, and it does really increase the sense of presence. And before I went out to Sundance this year, I had a chance to go out and visit the Void, which is another one of these mixed reality experiences.
Right there in Utah. You went all over Utah.
Yeah, I went down and had a chance to check out and do a demo and run through a couple of their experiences, and it was literally quite amazing to be able to have my mind fooled into walking around circles, whereas I just thought I was walking in straight lines. So I had this experience of just kind of like walking for what seemed like forever, and every time I would reach out and touch and look for a wall, I would find a wall, and my mind at some point was just like, okay, I'm here, I'm in this this virtual reality world. My rational mind knew I was at the Void in the south of Salt Lake City, but my mind just believed I was immersed in kind of like this infinite virtual world. And so I think this is what I would call kind of like beyond room scale, like these digital out-of-home entertainment with VR, where they're able to give you this experience of walking around this 60 foot by 60 foot square that has a minimum radius that you need to be able to kind of walk in a quarter circle, but feel like you're walking in a straight line.
So that's how they do it. So basically, real quick, so this is the prototype of a virtual reality theme park, I guess. They use heat lamps and they blow kind of steam at you to enhance the experience. But you were saying, and I wasn't aware of that these experiences are rather small, and they trick you you actually don't walk in a straight line, but you walk in a half circle.
It's called redirected walking, is a technique from academia, and they say that you need at least 22 meters or a little over 70 feet. They actually use 60 feet, which I think it works pretty well. But the thing that they're doing that's different is that they actually have physical walls. So they have this like 60 foot by 60 foot configuration that they developed such that you could walk around, and there's different decision points. That was the thing that was really important for them, is that they didn't want you to just feel like you had no choice to just keep on walking in a straight line, but there's different points where you're like turning around corners, and they're doing things like kind of you're only turning not quite 90 degrees, let's say, and then in VR you're turning exactly 90 degrees. And so they do all these kind of magic tricks to trick your mind into believing that you're in this space where you're making these right turns and walking straight, but you're actually kind of like not quite turning full and kind of walking in circles. And so that they're able to create these maps that and in Unity would fold on top of each other, but in real life feel like you're just kind of like exploring this world indefinitely. And this is an example where, I could see going to like the, Void arcade, or if there may be other ones in the future, to go and experience something that you could literally not experience in your home. And that this is, especially with all the different 5D effects of, like you said, rumble, like there's a point where we're going up an elevator and they're kind of rumbling the ground. There's wind blowing on you, there's mist, there's like heat lamps, and there's like torches and other things that you could have as objects and props within the experience. And so, well, there's going to be all sorts of different, movie studios that are producing content to go along with these as kind of to promote and brand their other movie experiences. And I think that it's going to be really compelling for people to go and have these experiences. And they're mostly going to be co-op experiences. They're not going to be really able to do first-person shooter against each other, because you could just imagine running around and bumping into each other physically. So they're mostly going to be co-op experiences where you're exploring these different areas.
Interesting. Now, to close this is actually would be my final question, unless you want to pick out your top experience at Sundance again, going back to Sundance. Oh, wait a minute, two more. Actually, now it comes to mind, the Leviathan project that we just talked about with the physical anchors. At the very end of that experience, you become that creature that you create in that story, and then you fly. And I found that really crazy compelling. And maybe because I was so anchored before, then when it switches to flying, it was even more impactful. Because I was already tricked into really being there by being able to touch these physical objects, and then all of a sudden everything was gone and I was flying.
Yeah, that was really cool. It was gaze-based flying, so depending on where you were looking at, you would kind of fly in that direction, and that did feel really cool. You kind of mind meld with the, you have one of four creatures to create, and then you create it, and you're flying around
the steampunk ship. I know, Loki Elliott, if you're listening, you're gonna go like, "Oh my God, yes, all steampunk, and you're flying around a ship."
Yeah.
I'm addressing our one of our 5 listeners directly. Sorry, go ahead, Kent.
I was just going to give a shout out to one of my favorite experiences there, the Real Virtuality Immersive Explorers. This is an experience where they actually had tracking on your hands and on your feet. And so, again, this is one of the experiences that if you didn't sign up for right away, it got booked up pretty much all day, because it was such this amazing experience of having full body presence, both your hands and your feet. And so that's what it kind of takes to invoke the virtual body ownership illusion, where you actually feel like your body is your body. You could kind of get it in the Leviathan project, but your feet weren't really tracked. And so to have your full body and to kind of walk around with another person, to me, was one of the most compelling things that I saw there at the Sundance New Frontier program.
Were you able to see your body there in that one, or no?
Yeah, you can. You kind of see your avatar and you see your feet, and you can kind of reach out and touch the other person that's there as well. And it's just kind of like this experience. You're on this sci-fi ship. You have to take these physical things to plug into this box at the same time as a co-op, and then once you do that, then you teleport to another area. Then you're kind of on this platform. You're flying through this Blade Runner type world where you're looking all around, and it just felt like I was in Blade Runner. And the art style was, a lot to be desired. But yeah, it didn't really matter because it felt like I was actually there in that world and walking around. And then you go into a cave and kind of just walk around a few corners, and you kind of feel like you have to step over these squares that if you miss the stairs, then you would like fall off a cliff or something. And so it kind of got this like, oh, wow, this is dangerous type of feeling as you're walking around these corners with the torch, and then you basically touch this crystal ball.
And basically, I hear you saying, I mean, because you said, the aesthetic maybe wasn't yours or was left much to be desired, but basically this kind of worked for you because of the tracking also of the feet.
Yeah, just the sense of having a full body presence. You kind of forgive a lot because honestly, a lot of the experiences here at the Sundance New Frontier weren't kind of like top experiences in terms of visual fidelity that I've been able to see out and trying all these different VR experiences. But they were making different types of innovations and pushing the kind of the language of VR forward in different ways. And so I think it's important to kind of realize that it's not all about looking good, but also like telling a good story. And like perspective, for example, was probably the most innovative in terms of narrative storytelling in VR. Sonar was great for people to check out in terms of other kind of narrative storytelling techniques within VR. And Giant was another experience that tells a story of a woman who grew up in a war-torn Serbia with bombs dropping, and so she kind of recreated what her parents, how they would treat her, trying to make up this story that like instead of bombs, it was this giant that was walking around. And so you just get this sense of actually being this present within this basement with this family that's, being bombed. And, there's different moments when, the bombs strike. And it just, there's different types of stories that I think that create this sense of empathy that once you're there in VR, it creates a sense of presence, and you have a different level of connection. You feel like you're there, and I think it can be a lot more moving than just say 2D media. So I saw a number of examples of people who were using, Chris Milk and from Verse, where he talks about the empathy machine, but also some people who were like, I don't think, they weren't true believers of VR as like an empathy machine. Some people just wanted to have a lot of fun of just, exploring your imagination and take people to other worlds.
Right. And then they went into the Slaughterhouse exhibit. I was at the Immersive Journalism Summit. Somebody in the audience brought up a very good question. She said, I went into the Slaughterhouse exhibit experience where you're inside the slaughterhouse, you see the animals being killed, and it was so overwhelming. And she used the word trauma, being traumatized, basically. So that is, again, moving forward, the question that was put to the panel was, where is the line? Where's the warning? Does there have to be a warning? I have a certain opinion on that. I think we need to show horror, because if we don't show it, that's that in terms of journalism. But she made a good point. She just wanted, okay, let me try this on, and then all of a sudden, she's in the slaughterhouse. On the other hand, the experience was called Slaughterhouse. It wasn't called Pony Show. So I guess buyer beware.
Yeah, that's I've talked about this on my podcast a number of times, and there's actually this is a case that went to the Supreme Court where the Electronics Software Association, basically this collection of video game companies, has an arm that deals with the Congress politics and the Supreme Court, and they took a case to the Supreme Court and had it settled that there's a First Amendment right for people to be able to express whatever they want within the virtual reality medium. Now, there's probably going to be self-regulatory like ratings on these different experiences. Right now, it's a little bit of the Wild West, so there's no trigger warnings or anything like that. But I can imagine a time when there's certain sensitive topics that maybe are called out, so that if you've had a traumatic experience in your life already that VR could trigger, then maybe there'll be a way for people to disclose that in a way that, they're not suddenly surprised when they either have a gun pointed at their face or, they see a rape or, suicide or any different types of topics that may be sensitive for people. But I think it's important to recognize that creating content in VR is a First Amendment right to protect people to create whatever they want, that it's not going to be censored by the government. Let's hope not. And that hopefully the industry will be able to find a way to self-regulate, to be able to, in the video game industry, they have ratings. So they can have a combination of ratings and potentially other ways of kind of flagging sensitive material.
So awesome. Let's wrap this up with a final thought on accessibility to content creation, which is my big topic. I've been looking around here. We know what we have available is the Jaunt Neo camera. It's not available outside unless you have connections and they give you one. You have the GoPro Odyssey GoPro Array, $15,000. Now we're talking 360 video. I mean, the other stuff is accessible. Unity is available. Unreal is available. But in terms of 360 video, there's not much available. What needs to happen now for the general public to go in and be at the table in terms of creation, and not just be sort of relegated to, like you said earlier, the industry making really yummy experiences based on property, big properties and stuff like that. I mean, since this is my podcast, the beauty is I can be rambling on my soapbox where I find that intensely boring that Hollywood is selling us the same old. I mean, again, but then people like Noni, I mean, they came from outside of the machine. They were able to do stuff. And Brett Lichtenstein, who I've known for a long time, they just went out there, experimented. So it is possible. But in your mind, what needs to happen to make this truly accessible? Either 360 or virtual, call it CGI centric experiences.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be a matter of time for when this technology gets put into cell phones more and more. I think that we're going to start to see depth sensor cameras within our cell phones, and then perhaps eventually, instead of having to buy a Ricoh Theta, maybe our cell phone will have a 360 video camera on it. And I think that's something that just over time, as the consumer demand grows for having VR experiences, then there's going to be more and more desire for this user-generated type of content. I know there was one company called 8i, which does a number of different photogrammetry effects to be able to take an array of DSLR cameras and be able to create a volumetric expression of, that looks very photoreal within VR. So technologies like that, perhaps, but what we really want is something like that's available on our cell phones, so that as something interesting or compelling is happening, somebody could sort of hold up their camera, ideally put it onto a tripod, because if it's not, then it could potentially bring a lot of motion sickness, because as cameras are moving around, then you watch that in VR, then it's just could be nauseating. So I think that's the thing that, over time, over the next 5 years, it'll just take time as, we're just on the precipice of having these virtual reality headsets launch here at the end of March of 2016 with Oculus. We already have the consumer launch of the Gear VR back on November 20th of 2015, and we'll see the PlayStation VR and Vive probably either in the second quarter or third quarter this year, some combination of those. So by the end of 2016, we'll have 3 or 4 major virtual reality head-mounted displays. Google, of course, probably be a 5th. They have their Google Cardboard. They've shipped over 5 million of those. So as we're kind of in this moment where there's the content technology, there's the content, and then there's the users. So up to this point, the last 2.5 years or so has been this going back and forth between the content creators and the technologists, going back and forth and iterating with what's possible. Each technological innovation changes what content's available. Now we're going to be putting this into the mainstream, and as we get more and more people who are watching these 360 video experiences, then the consumer demand to actually create those experiences will also go up. So I'd imagine, over the next year or 2 or 3, as people get a chance to actually see this content, then they'll have a vision for what content they want to create, and then that consumer demand, I think, will drive the technology to make it, eventually, ideally on our cell phones so that everybody could create it.
In 360 video, and then of course Linden Lab is building Project Sansar VR creation out of the box, and we'll see where that goes. Okay, awesome. And now I do have the last question. Now there's always one. Do we know if people can see, because again Sundance is also an elitist affair, who can go there, who can see these things? We can, because we're elitists. We just hop around the world and do stuff. No, I'm just kidding, but that bugs me. But then, in all fairness, this stuff is available on Google Cardboard and on the Sundance app, I'm told. But I have not tried it. Have you tried it?
Yeah, there's some of the app, they send you to the actual website of Sundance where you can't actually see even though there's supposed to be like 11 or 12 experiences available through the Sundance VR app. Milk VR also has a channel where they're going to be showing some of this stuff. Honestly, some of this stuff has already been released and out there in terms of like Surge, for example. And I know that Irrational Exuberance is like a Vive experience that will probably be released. And Job Simulator, you can watch the Rosebud on the Gear VR. That's basically the Rosa and I on a Gear VR version, but they had a full room scale version here. Or the Blue, the Encounter, that's something that's on a demo loop. So some of these stuff are already out there. I know that like Felix and Paul have plans to kind of release their own app at some point. So really, that's the stuff that I'd recommend is probably some of the best 360 video stuff that's out there. Chris Milk and Verse, all their content that was showing here at Sundance is also freely available through the Verse app that's on Oculus Home. And then Weaver, WeVR, is they had a number of experiences. So like the Waves experience with Reggie Watts will probably be available through them at some point. I think Sonar is available. Sisters, a mobile VR experience is available. Most of the stuff I think is going to be available at some point. The one experience that's definitely not going to be available is Veins, which is kind of like this exploration of polyamory with 7 people doing different sensual foreplay things for about 12 minutes. So that's something that I could say for sure is not going to be released, but was quite an experience to have there at Sundance.
That was at Sundance too?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I did an interview with the creator there, Michelle.
What did the Mormons say?
Well, I don't think they were there at the New Frontier. I think the Mormons were. If they were, I didn't talk to any of them. So.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, this is a good point, and what this is all mixed stuff that you were mentioning now. This is some of it is Gear VR, some of it is cardboard, I guess, or cardboard versions available, I guess, of some of these things. So they are somewhat available, but still, my mantra is democratize it. And I was interviewed by Democracy Now! And I made an extremely coherent soundbite, which was brilliant, if I can say so myself. And of course, I was cut, and I ended up on the cutting room floor. And I have to live with this for the rest of my life.
Oh, well, it's good that you have your own podcast, so the only person that can cut you is yourself.
Screw you, Democracy Now! I don't need you. I'm not going to pledge anymore. That's it. Okay, Ken. Absolute pleasure talking to you, running into you. Awesome, and we'll be listening to where you go next.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Drax. And tune into the Voices of VR podcast on voicesofvr.com, and I'll be having at least a good 2 or 3 weeks worth of explorations with different filmmakers and really looking into the question of interactive storytelling within VR. So got some great stuff that I'm looking forward to getting out there. But thanks for having me.
And thanks for listening, Jo Yardley, and I will be back on February 12th. A new video is out February 5th. And that's it. Have a great weekend, guys, and bye.
The Drax Files Radio Hour with Jo Yardley is a weekly production of Basic Drax Entertainment. The show is supported by Maven Homes, Giza Creations, Botanical, Strawberry Sing, Abranimations, Eros Avatars, Caravel Design, Avacon, The Cube Republic, Fateware by Damien Fate, The Avazines Publication Family, What Next, Bright Canopy, Dutchy Furniture, Landscapes Unlimited, Dwarfins, The Den, Fallen Gods Incorporated, Feroce SL, Giant Snail Races every Saturday, Kona Stream, and Death Row Designs. Contact the show via Skype, Drax Files, Avatar Drax Files, or email radio@draxfiles.com.